Welcome to Rehab Arena. Today we're working with someone 3 months out from a left middle cerebral artery stroke who's dealing with right-sided weakness affecting both the arm and the leg. This person is motivated to get back to work, walk without a cane, and tackle the stairs to their apartment. But right now, balance is a real challenge, and there's some stiffness building up in the arm that we need to manage. The big question hanging over everything is whether we can build enough strength, coordination, and confidence to make those functional goals real while keeping them safe and engaged in their own recovery. Let's get into the arena and see what we're working with. Welcome to Stage 0, Case Understanding and Opening Positions, where we find out if our contenders have actually read the file and know what they're walking into.
This is a 45-year-old man, 3 months post-left MCA ischemic stroke, with persistent right-sided motor, balance, gait, and hand function limitations that are directly blocking return to work, independent stair access, and meal preparation. My initial direction is to prioritize functional carryover through task-relevant rehab while not losing sight of specific impairment drivers like hand weakness, balance, and executive dysfunction.
All right, Pathfinder got us started strong, and now let's see what Blueprint brings to the table.
3 months post-left MCA stroke with mixed motor, balance, gait, hand, and executive function impairments. The main bottlenecks look mechanistically tied to upper limb motor output spasticity, walking capacity, stair negotiation, and adherence cognition affecting carryover.
All right, Blueprint brought the foundation. Now let's see what Ledger has to add to this conversation.
45-year-old man, 3 months after left MCA ischemic stroke, with persistent right hemiparesis, balance gait impairment, right hand weakness spasticity, mild cognitive deficits, and major participation limits affecting work, stairs, and cooking. My initial direction is to frame this as a subacute stroke rehab case where task-specific upper limb practice, gait balance work, and adherence participation barriers are the main early priorities.
All right, we've got Ledger's perspective on the table, and now let's hear what Ground Truth has to say about all this.
This is a working-age man 3 months after left MCA ischemic stroke with right hemiparesis, balance gait impairment, limited right hand function, mild cognitive deficits, and low home exercise adherence. The practical priority is a plan that is simple, structured, and feasible enough to fit outpatient rehab plus a solo apartment stairs context.
All right, we've got the foundation laid, and now let's see how Faultline responds to that opening move.
This is a 45-year-old man, 3 months after a left MCA ischemic stroke, with persistent right-sided motor impairment, balance gait limitations, cognitive executive deficits, and poor home program adherence. The main issue is not just impairment severity, but whether the proposed rehab plan is realistic given motivation, access barriers, and functional goals.
All right, that was an incredible round from our participant. Now let's bring in our expert judges to break down what we just saw. Bench, you're up first. Take it away.
Overall, all 5 participants stayed close to the case and avoided major, implausible leaps. Pathfinder, Blueprint, and Ledger each offered solid but fairly standard interpretations. They were useful, but not especially differentiating. Ground Truth stood out most because the case's biggest constraint is not only impairment, but whether the plan can actually be executed, given poor adherence, low motivation, and stair-dependent living. Faultline added a good corrective by emphasizing implementation realism and safety, though it was less additive than Ground Truth. No participant made a major unsafe or incoherent claim, so there are no penalties.
Let's see what Seal has to say about this one.
All 5 participants demonstrated generally strong claim honesty and citation discipline for Stage 0. None made severe, unsupported assertions, and all explicitly acknowledged uncertainty. Pathfinder, Blueprint, Ledger, Ground Truth, and Faultline each used evidence in a restrained way, with clear separation between case facts and inference. The main difference was not correctness, but how carefully each participant framed the evidence. Ledger and Ground Truth were slightly stronger on transparency about evidence scope and feasibility constraints, while the others were still solid. No penalties are warranted because each participant searched and did not present evidence-backed claims as more certain than the material supports.
The judges loved that everyone stayed grounded in the case itself, But ground truth really stood out by zeroing in on what actually matters most. This isn't just about the stroke impairment. It's about whether any plan can actually stick, given the real barriers of poor adherence, low motivation, and a stare-dependent home. Now we move into stage 1, where the pressure ramps up, and we're going to see whether each team can build a rehab strategy that's not just clinically sound, but genuinely executable in this person's actual life. Welcome to stage 1 primary argumentation, where we're going to sharpen the core argument and lock in the direction that matters most. This is where clarity wins and the real foundation gets built.
Prioritize task-specific, function-linked rehab that directly targets work, walking, stairs, and cooking, while also addressing the specific impairment drivers and adherence barriers that could prevent carryover.
All right, Pathfinder got us thinking, and now Blueprint is ready to build on that momentum.
Prioritize intensive task-specific rehabilitation aimed at the main measurable bottlenecks: right upper limb motor output, gait balance, and adherence carryover, because these are the clearest drivers of his work, stair and home function limits.
All right, Blueprint laid down some serious foundation there, and now let's see what Ledger brings to the table.
Prioritize task-specific, high-repetition stroke rehabilitation anchored to the patient's real goals, with explicit support for gait balance, upper limb function, and adherence, because carryover is likely the main limiter.
All right, Ledger brought the foundation. Now, let's see how ground truth builds on that energy.
Prioritize a simple, task-specific outpatient plan that directly targets walking, stand use, and work-like practice, because feasibility and adherence are the main determinants of whether this patient will actually improve.
Ground truth just laid down some serious foundation here. And now let's see what Faultline brings to the table.
The main direction is task-specific, function-linked stroke rehab, but the weak link is not the label of the intervention. It is whether the plan is realistic enough to overcome poor adherence, mild executive dysfunction, and a second-floor access barrier.
And that brings us to the end of the participant round. Now it's time for our judges to share their insights. So let's bring in Bench to kick things off.
Across the stage, all 5 participants were broadly case fidelitous and converged on a task-specific, function-linked stroke rehab direction. The strongest differentiator for Bench was not whether task-specific training was named, but whether the participants showed the plan would actually work for this patient. Ground truth was the clearest on that point, explicitly prioritizing feasibility and adherence in the setting of poor compliance, mild executive deficits, and a second-floor walk-up. Faultline also improved the reasoning space by stressing adherence engineering and cognitive cueing, though the contribution was slightly less direct than ground truth's. Pathfinder, Blueprint, and Ledger were all coherent and plausible, with good linkage between impairments and participation goals, but they were more ordinary because they did not push the implementation constraints as forcefully. Overall, the stage moved in a positive direction toward practical, safe, patient-fit rehab logic, with adherence and environmental barriers emerging as the most important unresolved issue.
Let's hear what Seal has to say about this performance.
Overall, all 5 participants stayed within the evidence base and avoided major unsupported claims. Ledger and ground truth were strongest because they tied the search-derived guidance to the patient's specific participation limits, while explicitly preserving uncertainty. Pathfinder and Blueprint were also sound, but a bit more general and less materially anchored than the top 2. Faultline was careful and appropriately skeptical, especially about implementation barriers, though the SOOP mention was somewhat less directly supported than the core task-specific training claim. No participant crossed into unsafe overstatement or failed the search compliance expectation.
The judges saw a really strong convergence around task-specific training today. But here's what separated the best from the rest. It wasn't just naming the right approach, it was proving the plan would actually stick with this patient in a real second-floor walk-up with compliance challenges and executive deficits. Ground Truth and Faultline earned the highest marks because they didn't just say what to do, they engineered how to make it happen and what could go wrong. While the other 3 stayed coherent and evidence-grounded but didn't push as hard on those implementation realities. Now we move to stage 2. where the judges are going to pressure test whether your rehab plans stay practical and safe when you have to commit to concrete, realistic supports for stair safety and home carryover. Because that's where task-specific training either translates into real life or it doesn't. Welcome to Stage 2, the cross-challenge and critique, where things heat up fast, because now these candidates are facing real pressure and direct feedback from the room. This is where we find out who can stand their ground, adapt on the fly, and actually listen when the heat is on.
The strongest framing is still function first, but competing plans are weak if they overfocus on impairment drills without solving adherence, home access, and work task transfer. Real-world carryover is the main test here.
All right, let's see how Blueprint responds to that opening salvo.
The strongest frame is that the case is being driven by specific motor, balance, and carryover bottlenecks, but any plan that ignores feasibility and adherence is incomplete. The main critique is against overconfident impairment-only reasoning or overly elaborate rehab plans that the patient will not actually do.
Let's see how Ledger responds to that foundation blueprint just laid down.
The strongest framing is task-specific stroke rehab with feasibility safeguards. The weaker framing is any plan that assumes adherence, cognition, or environmental access will improve without being explicitly addressed.
All right, Ledger brought the foundation. Now let's see what ground truth has to build on that.
The strongest critique is that the rehab direction should stay simple and feasible. Task-specific training is reasonable, but proposals become weak if they ignore adherence, cognition, and the real-world barrier of a second-floor walk-up.
All right, we've heard from ground truth. Now let's see what Faultline brings to the table.
The strongest framing is still task-specific, participation-linked stroke rehab, but several competing positions overstate certainty and underweight feasibility. Adherence, mild executive deficits, and stair access constraints are likely the real weak links.
All right, that was fantastic work out there. And now it's time to hear from our expert panel. Let's bring in our judges, starting with Bench, who's ready to break down what we just witnessed.
Overall, the stage moved in a useful direction. All 5 participants converged on task-specific, function-linked stroke rehab. But the stronger contributions were the ones that did not stop at the intervention label. Pathfinder, Blueprint, Ledger, Ground Truth, and Faultline each acknowledged the patient's motor deficits, balance limits, and participation goals. Yet the most valuable reasoning was the repeated insistence that adherence, mild executive dysfunction, and stair access are decisive implementation constraints. Ledger and Ground Truth improved the reasoning space most because they explicitly translated the case into a feasible, low-friction plan logic and avoided overclaiming evidence or technology. Faultline also added a strong safety lens. None of the participants made a major unsafe leap, but some were less differentiated in how they handled evidence strength and practical execution.
Now let's hear from Seal on the bench.
Overall, all 5 participants stayed within a defensible, evidence-aware frame, but Ground Truth, Ledger, and Faultline were strongest on claim honesty and support alignment. Pathfinder and Blueprint were also sound, but their evidence use was a bit more general and less sharply constrained. No participant made a severe unsupported assertion, and each explicitly acknowledged uncertainty rather than hiding it. The main differentiator was how carefully they limited the implied certainty of task-specific rehabilitation evidence when applied to this patient's adherence and access barriers.
All 5 teams nailed the fundamentals by grounding their plans in task-specific, function-linked stroke rehab. But the judges really rewarded the ones who went deeper and asked the harder questions about what actually sticks in the real world. Ground Truth, Ledger, and Faultline stood out because they didn't just name the intervention. They built a low-friction logic that honestly reckoned with adherence challenges, that second-floor walk-up as a genuine safety constraint, and the limits of what the evidence actually promises for this particular patient. Stage 3 is going to pressure test whether these teams can keep that same intellectual honesty when the case gets messier and the temptation to overcomplicate creeps in. Welcome to Stage 3, revision, defense, and rebuttal, where the best ideas have to survive contact with criticism, and our competitors prove they can think on their feet and stand behind what they've built. let's see who can take the heat and come out stronger on the other side.
I continue to defend a function-first, task-specific rehab direction, but I am narrowing the claim. The key issue is not just choosing the right exercises, it is making them feasible enough to transfer to work, stairs, cooking, and daily living.
All right, let's see how Blueprint builds on what we just heard.
I keep the core direction, simple task-specific stroke rehab, but narrow the claim. The real limiter is whether the plan is deliverable despite low adherence, mild executive deficits, and the apartment stairs constraint.
Let's see how Ledger responds to that framework.
I keep the function-first, task-specific rehab frame, but I narrow the claim. The main issue is not whether task-specific training is appropriate, but whether the plan is feasible enough to overcome poor adherence, mild executive dysfunction, and stair access constraints.
All right, Ledger brought the foundation. Now let's see how Ground Truth builds on that energy.
Task-specific stroke rehab still makes sense, but my position is now narrower. The plan should be simple, highly structured, and adherence-aware, because feasibility is the main determinant of whether this patient will actually benefit.
All right, we've got some powerful perspective on the table. And now, let's hear what Faultline has to bring to this conversation.
Task-specific, participation-linked stroke rehab remains defensible, but the weak link is implementation. Adherence, mild executive deficits, and stair access constraints are likely more limiting than the intervention label itself.
All right, that was fantastic work out there. And now it's time to hear from our expert panel. Let's bring in our judges, starting with Bench, who's ready to break down everything we just witnessed.
Overall, all 5 participants converged on a more disciplined position. Task-specific stroke rehab remains defensible, but the key limiter is implementation rather than theoretical appropriateness. Pathfinder and Blueprint both improved by narrowing their claims and acknowledging that feasibility and adherence are central in this patient. Ledger was the strongest because it tied the proposal tightly to the patient's measured deficits, participation problems, and known implementation barriers while avoiding overclaiming. Ground Truth was especially strong on practicality, making the case that simple, routine-embedded, adherence-aware rehab is more likely to help than a complex or assumption-heavy plan. Faultline added useful safety and monitoring cautions, particularly around fall risk and the walk-up apartment. No participant made a major unsafe leap, but the main watch point remains that none of the plans can be assumed to work unless they are simple enough for the patient to actually perform.
Now let's hear from our next judge, Seal.
Overall, all 5 participants improved by narrowing their claims and treating feasibility as a first-order issue rather than assuming task-specific rehab alone would solve the case. Ledger, Ground Truth, and Faultline were strongest on claim honesty and evidence alignment. They used the case facts well, explicitly noted limits of the evidence, and avoided overstating the effect of task-specific training. Pathfinder and Blueprint also stayed within bounds, but their evidence use was slightly less disciplined because they leaned more on general support, without as clearly fencing off what the evidence does not prove in this specific patient. No participant made a severe, unsupported assertion, so no penalties were warranted.
The judges were crystal clear on one thing. Task-specific stroke rehab makes sense on paper, but it only matters if this patient can actually do it and stick with it. So the real competition now is about who built the most honest, doable plan tied to what we know about her real-world barriers. Moving into the next stage, we're going to pressure test whether anyone starts overselling what task-specific training alone can deliver for return to work and stair independence, and whether their plans stay simple enough for someone with her adherence challenges to realistically follow through. We're moving into stage 4, where every word counts and the final statements are about to lock in the case. This is where our participants synthesize everything they've brought to the arena and prepare to leave nothing on the table.
My best supported direction is still a simple, function-first, task-specific stroke rehab plan, but delivered in a way that is realistic for his low motivation, mild executive deficits, and stair access demands. I changed from framing the problem as mainly impairment-driven to seeing feasibility and carryover as the main limiter.
All right, Pathfinder brought some serious perspective to the table And now let's see what Blueprint has to say about this.
Simple, task-specific stroke rehab remains the best supported direction, but the plan must be tightly constrained by feasibility, adherence, and the apartment stairs barrier.
All right, Blueprint brought the foundation. Now let's see how Ledger builds on that energy.
My best supported direction is a simple, task-specific outpatient stroke rehab plan focused on walking, stairs, hand use, and work-like practice, with feasibility and adherence treated as the main limiting factors.
All right, Ledger brought the foundation. Now let's see how Ground Truth builds on that energy.
Keep the rehab plan simple, task-specific, and tightly tied to walking, stairs, hand use, and work-like practice. The main shift is that feasibility and adherence now look like the decisive bottleneck.
Let's bring in Faultline to see where this conversation goes next.
Task-specific function-linked stroke rehab still looks right, but the real weak link is feasibility. Low adherence, mild executive deficits, and the second-floor walk-up make implementation the main determinant of benefit.
That was fantastic work out there. And now it's time to hear from our expert judges who are going to break down everything we just witnessed. Let's bring in the panel, starting with Bench.
Across the stage, all participants converged on a plausible, patient-fit direction. Simple, task-specific stroke rehabilitation, anchored to walking, stairs, hand use, and work-like practice. The strongest contributions were from Ground Truth and Ledger because they most clearly identified the real limiting factor as feasibility and adherence, not simply impairment selection. Faultline also added meaningful value by stress testing implementation and safety. Pathfinder improved by recentering on carryover and practicality, which was an important adjustment for this case. Blueprint remained solid, but comparatively less differentiated. Overall, the stage advanced the reasoning space by narrowing the plan toward high-yield, low-complexity, goal-linked activities, while keeping safety and environmental barriers in view.
Now let's hear what Seal has to say about this performance.
Across all 5 participants, the core evidence behavior was disciplined. Each searched, each used the search results to support the broad task-specific rehabilitation direction, and each avoided presenting a definitive treatment conclusion. Pathfinder, Blueprint, Ledger, Ground Truth, and Faultline all kept the case facts distinct from inference, and repeatedly noted that adherence and environmental feasibility were the key unresolved issues. The main differentiator was how carefully they handled uncertainty. Ledger and Ground Truth were slightly stronger because they most explicitly avoided over-claiming and described the evidence as general support rather than case-specific proof. No participant made a severe unsupported assertion, and none warranted a penalty for missing search because the stage requirement was met.
The judges saw real alignment today around task-specific stroke rehab anchored to walking, stairs, and hand use. And they really rewarded the teams that named feasibility and adherence as the actual limiting factor, instead of just picking exercises. Now, stage 5 is going to pressure test whether you can actually make this plan stick in a second-floor walk-up with a patient who's struggling with motivation and executive function. So, concrete adherence supports and realistic environmental design are going to matter way more than adding another category of exercises.
The arena has spoken. Ground Truth has earned this verdict through disciplined reasoning and sound clinical judgment. This is the direction that survived the pressure.
Confirmed. The evidentiary weight supports this outcome. Ground Truth demonstrated the strongest alignment between claims and support. The arena finds its answer.
Congratulations to P. Prag for taking the win today. You brought clarity, structure, and real-world practicality to the table. Your plan was grounded in what actually works for patients stepping back into their lives, and the judges absolutely felt that. Thanks so much to everyone who competed and pushed us to think smarter about rehabilitation. We'll see you next time on Rehab Arena.